In terms of facilitating the adaptation by people and firms, we've talked about various barriers, need for importing, making available the technology, latest information, etc. Action 1.4 is very critical because we have to ensure that financing is in fact available to all and support is provided to the poorest and the most vulnerable people for adaptation. Lead ministry here, again, just to read off what is suggested: economy or finance with social affairs and social protection. Adaptation, preventing and reducing future losses due to climate change, makes economic sense and private actors are incentivized to contribute to it. However, high upfront costs may stop them from implementing effective solutions. Even if these costs are more than compensated in the long term by avoided impacts and losses, the lack of financing can be a serious obstacle for credit-constrained firms and households. Mom-and-pop operations or small-scale enterprises and households may well be aware that investing on making the house better, more fortified against heavy rain or winds and so on, floods, etc., can benefit over the long term. The upfront investment needed, it could be as simple as rainwater harvesting to deal with water problems. So investment in the needed upfront may make it impossible for them to take these actions, even though they know that it will pay off. So financing will become critical in this case. Financial inclusion and a well-managed, stable financial system are important for increasing an economy's adaptive capacity. However, ensuring that financial solutions are accessible to all may require specific measures such as mobile banking to access savings and credit possibilities in rural households. Financial inclusions alone may not be enough to allow the poorest households to invest in managing risks or coping with shocks, so governments must take a role and responsibility in this. Okay. In terms of sample targets and indicators, here are some examples. Number of firms, people accessing dedicated financing instruments such as guarantees, subsidized loans can be a metric for seeing how people are using the available tools to protect themselves for the future against the future hazards. Total borrowing for adaptation through dedicated windows, most vulnerable populations and communities based on occupations, localizations, poverty, ethnicity, and so on, identified and information published. Vulnerability indices typically have multiple factors. In India, it could be religion, caste, kind of job you have, permanent or temporary, per capita income, etc. Share of poor and vulnerable population receiving support for adaptation is a good target and indicator. Total subsidy and spending, again, targeting poor and vulnerable populations to support adaptation action, of course, is a critical one to track action. In the absence of external support, hundreds of millions of people in or close to poverty will be impacted by climate change and have limited ability to respond and adapt. Governments are widely considered to be responsible for supporting vulnerable populations and helping them adapt to external stressors such as climate change. Multiple instruments can help with this, from direct cash transfers to reduce poverty to targeted subsidies for efficient irrigation equipment or air conditioning, but they all require governments to first identify the populations that are most vulnerable to climate change and least able to adapt, identify the impact channels through which they will be affected, design policies to support their ability to cope with and adapt to these impacts. In Toolbox, we will see what this means. Further, social safety nets targeted to poor households can be complemented by activities focused on climate adaptation and mitigation. Such safety nets have seen a dramatic expansion across the developing world over the last decade, involving conditional and unconditional cash transfers, or, where appropriate, in-kind benefits. There are three main types of safety net interventions that support household adaptation and mitigation to climate change, and they are: regular cash transfers that build household resilience to climate-related shocks and worsening livelihood conditions by facilitating livelihood diversification, building savings, and avoiding negative coping strategies. The idea here also is not just that it's a welfare program or a handout, but that the community as a whole is only as strong as its weakest link. So you want to prop up the poor and vulnerable so that labor force is available, productivity and so on are kept up by propping up the poor, reinforcing these cash transfers with accompanying measures focused on various development objectives such as economic inclusion and increases in productivity, human capital formation, and climate adaptation that are typically delivered through social workers, community organizations, and in partnership with civil society organizations. Explicitly, climate adaptive measures that can amplify the impacts of cash transfers on household resilience include behavior change interventions with information on timing of rainy and lean seasons or which crops to diversify out of or into, savings interventions to generate a buffer to absorb climate shocks or enable investments in adaptation or livelihood portfolio adjustment. So if there is a climate hazard that puts you out of job for a while, you need to have a buffer to survive through it and such, or repair the house if it gets damaged by a climate hazard. Skills training and coaching to support livelihood diversification. Finally, early childhood development, nutrition and health interventions focused on raising household and community capability to manage the impact of climate shocks on child development, nutrition, or food security. In terms of public works, where beneficiaries provide community services or build assets for cash or in-kind benefits as part of adaptive social protection, as well as promoting adaptation by providing cash to beneficiaries, such initiatives as public works have potential for climate mitigation through climate-sensitive works like reforestation, irrigation, combating soil erosion and water security, and by generating community assets that tackle the root causes of climate change vulnerability in a community. Okay, so deforestation may have caused high vulnerability to heavy rain, and reforestation or afforestation can recover the resilience to heavy rain. Taking action, toolbox B. So identifying climate change impacts on poor populations and poverty and defining priorities for action. Poor people are more vulnerable to environmental scarcity, stresses, shocks, and climate change impacts. Economic models based on national accounts such as computable general equilibrium models can underestimate this vulnerability. However, we don't say what this is, but you can look it up. I'm not going to go into this here. However, dedicated analysis of poor people's situations based on household surveys or micro simulations can help identify vulnerability hotspots and opportunities for high return interventions. This toolbox presents two complementary approaches with examples from Burundi, Georgia, and Tanzania to illustrate how countries can better inform policies. So there are some case studies looked at which provide some good examples on identifying climate change impacts on poor populations. I don't know if I want to read all this. Maybe I should go ahead and do it because it's a toolbox. Micro simulations and household level analysis. There is example of using World Bank's International Income Distribution Dataset, a global database of household surveys describing the distribution of income and occupations in 92 countries. Using microsimulation techniques, they projected the evolution of these households until 2030, driven by demographics, socioeconomic change, and climate change, to identify which impacts are most important for poverty outcomes in 92 countries, illustrating the results in Burundi and Georgia. We'll look at the figure next. So this figure shows that climate change is expected to have larger impact in Burundi for each metric. For example, income is predicted to drop by 4% in Burundi and 2.5% in Georgia by 2030. The biggest impact in Burundi will be the change in food prices, while in Georgia it's labor productivity. So region-specific factors are very critical to know what measures need to be taken to alleviate these future vulnerabilities. Governments can use this type of analysis alongside the simpler indicator-based approach proposed in Toolbox A, which we looked at before, to identify priorities for adaptation to minimize the impact of climate change on poverty and poor people. So here is figure B.1, projected impact of climate change by 2030 in Burundi and Georgia. So as we said, Burundi food prices will matter. So GNI impacts, so you have negative impacts from agricultural prices, revenues, diarrhea, health, disasters, malaria, stunting, temperature, and all impacts together. It's fairly massive in percentage. Gross national indices. Change in income of the bottom 40% in percentage from agricultural prices, revenues, diarrhea, disasters, malaria, stunting, temperature, all impacts is down to -5% or so. Additional extreme poverty, percentage of total population, again can be as high as 1.5%. Okay, so if you look at Georgia, the same things. You have agricultural prices, revenues, diarrhea, and so on, and change in income and additional extreme poverty. This is here scale is less than 0.6, whereas here it was 1.5% of the population, and here it's -5 and -4 and something. So this is -2.5 and less than -3.5. So obviously Georgia is somewhat better off compared to Burundi, but looking at dedicated household surveys can be highly effective to better understand the risks and challenges faced by a specific population in a specific context. Collecting household level data on income levels and disaster risk allows researchers to study exposure, disaster loss, and recovery capacity in relation to poverty. So that recovery capacity is often what we call resilience. For example, this paper collected a representative data set on, that's Ehrman et al. 2019, representative data set on income levels and flood risk from households in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, such as how many people are affected by flooding, how they are affected, and mechanisms and tools they use to recover, and how effective these are. And they use these to understand the extent of challenges and potential solutions. Surveys can provide both spatial and socioeconomic information to help identify vulnerability hotspots, which in turn can inform targeting and policy design. Okay, so let's leave that here and come back to action 1.5 in the next podcast. But you see how we are mixing various informations, indicators and metrics and toolboxes to make each point in priority area 1. So we will keep going to priority area 2 and 3 and then look at some additional points as we go along.